Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is fighting for his country's survival, and now he's fighting for a seat at the negotiating table. As Donald Trump prepares to meet Vladimir Putin in Alaska this Friday,
senior officials from the United States, Ukraine, and several European nations are set to convene in the United Kingdom this weekend to align their strategies ahead of a high-stakes summit between the US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, scheduled for August 15, 2025, in Alaska. The meeting, aimed at brokering peace in the ongoing Ukraine conflict, has raised concerns among European allies who feel excluded.
senior officials from the United States, Ukraine, and European nations have been scrambling to coordinate their strategies. The stakes couldn't be higher. Zelenskyy has rallied unprecedented support from Europe and NATO, demanding that any peace deal must include Ukraine.
Just a message from our team from Britain, Andriy Yermak. There were talks of security representatives of the United States of America and Europe. Ukraine, the United States, Vice President Vance, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Finland, Poland. The meeting was constructive. All our signals were transmitted. Our arguments are heard. The dangers are taken into account. The path to peace for Ukraine must be determined together, and only together with Ukraine. And this is the principle. It is important that
Representatives from Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Finland, and Poland have joined forces with Ukrainian officials and American representatives, including Vice President Vance, in urgent meetings to ensure Ukraine's voice is heard. We're witnessing a high-stakes diplomatic scramble that could determine the fate of the 3.5-year war and Ukraine's future as an independent nation. So what exactly is happening behind closed doors? And why are European leaders suddenly so worried about being left out? To understand this crisis, we need to look at how we got here. For weeks, Trump had been threatening Russia with new sanctions if Putin didn't agree to halt the conflict by August 8th. That deadline came and went, with no sanctions. Instead, Trump shocked the world by announcing he would hold a summit with Putin in Alaska on August 15th. The announcement sent shockwaves through European capitals, and Kyiv Ukrainian officials immediately feared they were about to be excluded from negotiations about their own country's future.
President Trump will go into a one-on-one meeting with President Putin, like he did, by the way, in Helsinki in 2018, the last time they had a big summit. No staffers in the room, no Russia specialist. His specialist back then, Fiona Hill, was kicked out. And Putin, I've been in meetings with Putin. He is very effective negotiator. He's a very effective twister of history. And he will then make a plea for why Donetsk, Mr. President, has always traditionally been part of Russia. Crimea, part of Russia. Acknowledge and recognize these facts, and then they're going to come out and have a press conference, and President Trump might say that. And that then will tie the hands of President Zelenskyy and his European allies in actually negotiating. That is their greatest fear. It's my greatest fear, too.
The prospect of Trump meeting Putin one-on-one, potentially without staff or Russia specialists present, represents Ukraine's worst-case scenario. Drawing from experience with past summits, diplomats warn that Putin could use such a meeting to convince Trump to recognize Russian claims to territories like Donetsk and Crimea, which would then tie the hands of Zelenskyy and European allies in actual negotiations. This wasn't just paranoia, it was based on hard experience. After representatives from Washington and Moscow held talks in Istanbul in February, Zelenskyy had lamented that once again, decisions about Ukraine are being made without Ukraine. The prospect of a Trump-Putin bilateral meeting triggered alarm bells across the continent. European leaders knew exactly what was at stake: the potential for a deal that could force Ukraine to surrender territory in exchange for peace.
In order to have that meeting, President Putin would have to agree to meet with President Zelenskyy. And that's a good idea. That's been an idea that White Houses, that administrations have used, which is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So Ukraine needs to be there to be part of that discussion if they're going to be talking about Ukraine.
And what would you anticipate from such a meeting if Ukraine were to be a part of it? Who would have the leverage going into that meeting, given the fact that President Trump did just ramp up the amount of military assistance the U.S. is giving to Ukraine?
President Trump clearly has the leverage. President Putin wants this meeting. He wants this meeting. As you've indicated, as you reported, President Putin is an indicted war criminal. He wants to get some credibility back. He wants to be admitted back to the table. And President Trump has said, yes, he'll be willing to do that. That surprised a lot of people, but that's what he wants to find a way to end the war, which is a good thing. However, as you say, President Zelenskyy needs to represent that side of the discussion.
Both sides want certain things that we have sort of publicly heard about in order for there to be any ceasefire agreement. From the perspective of Russia, we've heard them talk about, obviously, Crimea, but then the Donbass region. We've also heard Ukraine talk about the desire to join NATO. Do you anticipate those sorts of asks will be on the table in any discussion?
Trump himself had suggested as much, saying a potential agreement would involve some swapping of territories to the betterment of both sides. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, expressed surprise at Trump's statement about Zelenskyy not needing to attend, emphasizing the principle of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. He noted that while Trump clearly holds leverage in negotiations, with Putin seeking credibility and a return to the international table, despite being an indicted war criminal, any deal without Ukrainian involvement would undermine the peace process. For Ukraine, this was an existential threat. Zelenskyy has consistently maintained that any decisions taken without Ukraine will be stillborn and unworkable.
Dear Ukrainians, President Trump has announced preparations for his meeting with Putin in Alaska, a far cry from this war that is ongoing on our land against our people, which still cannot be ended without us, without Ukraine. Putin did not believe in our people, so he made this hopeless decision to try to take Ukraine. This was his main mistake, not to take into account the Ukrainians. I believed in our people. Because Ukrainians are strong, Ukrainians defend their own. Many in the world sided with Ukraine during the war. Even those who are with Russia know that it is doing evil. Of course, we will not give Russia any rewards for what it has done. The Ukrainian people deserve peace. But all partners must understand what a dignified peace is.
In response to Trump's announcement, the Ukrainian president made it clear that the war cannot be ended without Ukraine's involvement. He firmly declared that Putin's main mistake was underestimating the Ukrainian people's strength and determination to defend their land, and that Ukraine will not give Russia any rewards for its actions. The country has already lost significant territory to Russian occupation since 2014, including Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. The idea of surrendering even more land was unacceptable to Kyiv and its European allies. But here's where Zelensky's diplomatic strategy became brilliant. Instead of simply protesting the proposed summit, he launched a coordinated campaign to ensure European unity and NATO backing. The results were immediate and impressive. On Saturday, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Finland, and the European Commission issued a joint statement declaring that any diplomatic solution must protect the security interests of both Ukraine and Europe. This wasn't just symbolic support, it was a direct challenge to any attempt by Trump and Putin to negotiate over Ukraine's head. The message was clear. Europe would not accept a deal that didn't include Ukrainian consent. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas went even further, stating that the U.S. has the power to force Russia to negotiate seriously, while emphasizing that any deal between the U.S. and Russia must have Ukraine and the EU involved. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte echoed this position, making it clear that the alliance stood firmly behind Ukraine's right to participate in any negotiations about its future. But the diplomatic pressure didn't stop there. Behind the scenes, a complex game of leverage was playing out. White House officials, responding to the European pressure and Ukrainian concerns, reportedly made Putin's agreement to meet with Zelenskyy a prerequisite for any Trump-Putin summit. This was a significant shift from the original plan, which had envisioned a purely bilateral meeting between the American and Russian leaders. The Kremlin's response revealed just how reluctant Putin was to include Ukraine in any negotiations. Putin said he had nothing against meeting Zelenskyy, but claimed the conditions for such an encounter were unfortunately still far from being met. This wasn't surprising. Putin has consistently described Ukraine's government as illegitimate and has said he would only meet Zelenskyy during the final phase of negotiations. However, the pressure campaign appeared to be working. Trump himself seemed to waver on whether a Putin-Zelenskyy meeting was necessary, initially saying it wasn't a condition for his summit with Putin, then later suggesting he remained open to a trilateral summit with both leaders. The confusion reflected the intense diplomatic maneuvering taking place behind the scenes. What made Zelenskyy's position particularly strong was the timing of recent NATO developments. Just months earlier, at the NATO summit in The Hague, Zelenskyy had secured significant commitments from European allies. Despite some tensions with Trump, who had criticized Zelenskyy earlier in the year, their meeting at the summit had been surprisingly productive. Trump had acknowledged that sending more Patriot missile systems would help Ukraine's cause and had even discussed potential co-production of drones with Ukraine. More importantly, NATO members had agreed to dramatically increase their defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035, more than double the previous target. This commitment demonstrated European determination to strengthen their own security and reduce dependence on American protection. For Zelenskyy, this provided crucial leverage in the current crisis. The European support wasn't just rhetorical. Countries like the UK announced concrete military aid, with Prime Minister Keir Starmer pledging 350 air defense missiles funded by seized Russian assets. The Netherlands committed to providing new drones and radar systems. These commitments showed that Europe was prepared to step up its support for Ukraine even if American aid became uncertain. But the real test of Zelenskyy's diplomatic strategy came in how it affected Russian calculations. Putin's position had been that he was winning the war and could achieve his goals of subjugating Ukraine without making significant concessions. The prospect of facing a united Western front, however, complicated this calculus. Russia's demands have remained maximalist. Long-term seizure of Ukrainian territory, a promise that Ukraine would never join NATO, and the effective neutering of Ukraine's military and geopolitical independence. Western analysts have described these terms as rendering Ukraine a vassal state of Russia. The unified European response made it clear that such demands would not be accepted by the international community. The diplomatic scramble also revealed important dynamics within the Trump administration. Vice President J.D. Vance's meetings with EU allies and Ukrainian officials in the UK demonstrated that even within the American government, there was recognition of the need to coordinate with European partners. The talks at the UK Foreign Secretary's estate in Kent brought together representatives from multiple countries to forge a united stance before any Trump-Putin meeting. What emerged from these discussions was a more sophisticated approach to potential negotiations. Rather than simply opposing any talks between Trump and Putin, European leaders and Ukrainian officials were working to ensure that any negotiations would be multilateral and would respect Ukrainian sovereignty. The strategy appeared to be working. Reports suggested that the White House was increasingly receptive to including Zelenskyy in some capacity, even if initially as a follow-up to bilateral Trump-Putin talks. This represented a significant victory for Zelenskyy's diplomatic campaign. The broader implications of this crisis extend far beyond the immediate question of who sits at the negotiating table. The episode has demonstrated the continued importance of European unity in the face of potential American unilateralism. It has also shown that smaller countries like Ukraine can successfully mobilize international support when their core interests are threatened. For NATO, the crisis has been a test of alliance cohesion. The fact that European members were willing to publicly challenge potential American policy shows both the strength of their commitment to Ukraine and their determination to maintain influence over European security issues. The response also reflected lessons learned from previous conflicts where European voices were marginalized in favor of great power politics. The economic dimensions of the conflict add another layer of complexity. European countries have invested heavily in supporting Ukraine, not just militarily, but also economically. The EU's $35 billion financial aid package represents a significant commitment to Ukraine's long-term viability. European leaders are understandably reluctant to see this investment undermined by a negotiated settlement that doesn't protect their interests. Looking at the military situation on the ground, the timing of this diplomatic crisis is particularly significant. Russia has been attempting a summer offensive, but Ukrainian forces have reportedly made progress in rebuffing these efforts. Ukrainian General Oleksandr Syrsky has confirmed that there are plans for offensive operations, stating that victory cannot be achieved in defense. This military context strengthens Ukraine's negotiating position and makes European allies more confident in their support. The technological aspects of the conflict also play a role in current diplomatic calculations. Ukraine's success in drone warfare and its ability to strike targets deep inside Russia have demonstrated that the country remains a formidable military opponent, despite being outgunned in conventional terms. This reality makes the prospect of forcing Ukraine to accept unfavorable terms more difficult. The human cost of the conflict continues to mount, with Trump himself acknowledging that people are dying at levels that people haven't seen before for a long time. This creates pressure for a negotiated solution, but also reinforces Ukrainian determination not to accept terms that would simply delay rather than end Russian aggression. Intelligence assessments add urgency to the diplomatic efforts. German military strategists believe Russia could come directly at NATO by 2030, making the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict crucial for broader European security. This timeline puts additional pressure on all parties to find a sustainable solution rather than a temporary ceasefire. The role of other global powers also influences the diplomatic equation. While China has maintained its stated neutrality, its economic relationship with Russia provides Moscow with crucial support. Any negotiated settlement would need to account for these broader geopolitical relationships. What makes Zelensky's current position particularly strong is the evolution of international opinion about the conflict. Initially, some Western observers had hoped for a quick negotiated settlement that might involve Ukrainian territorial concessions. However, nearly 4 years of war have demonstrated that Putin's goals extend far beyond limited territorial gains to the fundamental transformation of Ukraine's political system. This recognition has strengthened international support for Ukrainian positions and made European leaders more skeptical of compromise solutions. The current diplomatic crisis also reflects broader changes in the international system. The era of great power negotiations over the heads of smaller countries, reminiscent of 20th century power politics, is being challenged by a more multilateral approach that emphasizes the sovereignty and agency of all states, regardless of size. Zelensky's success in mobilizing European support represents a victory for this more inclusive approach to international relations. As we look toward the potential Trump-Putin meeting, several scenarios remain possible. The most likely outcome appears to be some form of expanded dialogue that includes European and Ukrainian representatives, rather than a purely bilateral American-Russian negotiation. This would represent a significant diplomatic victory for Zelensky and his European allies. However, the fundamental disagreements between the parties remain unchanged. Russia continues to demand territorial concessions and limitations on Ukrainian sovereignty that Ukraine and its allies find unacceptable. Putin shows no sign of moderating his maximalist goals, while Ukraine remains determined to regain all its territory and maintain its independence. The success of Zelensky's diplomatic campaign demonstrates the continued importance of alliance politics in the modern international system. By mobilizing European and NATO support, Ukraine has shown that even smaller countries can successfully influence great power negotiations when they build effective coalitions. This lesson will likely influence diplomatic strategies in other conflicts around the world. The episode also highlights the complex relationship between military and diplomatic developments. Ukraine's continued military resistance has provided the foundation for its diplomatic success, while the prospect of negotiations has influenced military planning and resource allocation. The integration of these two dimensions of statecraft will continue to be crucial as the conflict evolves. What happens next will depend largely on how Putin responds to the international pressure. If he continues to insist on bilateral negotiations with Trump while excluding Ukraine and Europe, he risks further international isolation. If he agrees to more inclusive negotiations, it could open the door to more serious peace talks, though fundamental disagreements about Ukraine's future would still need to be resolved. For now, Zelenskyy has achieved his immediate goal of ensuring that Ukraine has a voice in any negotiations about its future. The backing of EU and NATO allies provides crucial support for this position. Whether this diplomatic success can be translated into a sustainable peace agreement remains to be seen, but Ukraine has demonstrated that it will not accept being a passive object of great power negotiations. The stakes could not be higher, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire international system based on sovereignty and self-determination.